Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 6, Spring in Autumn. Morning had yet to break apart night completely when Suzuki and his team reached Mist's borders. Owls hooted and birds trilled in trees behind the dense leaves, their low slanting branches touching one of the brooks that ran out of the village. Suzuki dropped his gaze and looked about his feet. Mist was thick and seemed to spread out from around his sandals. He turned on his Sharingan and scanned the area. 3 people stood vigilant at the gates, and one of them had Byakugan in his left eye. Suzuki cracked his warmed knuckles and made his way to the gate. The man who had his Byakugan out and ready immediately recognized the red in Suzuki's eyes. He walked beyond the gate's safe boundary, flanked with 2 clear streams on both sides, and came into view, breaking the mist about him. "Welcome, Suzuki-sama," he said and bowed. His eyes wandered slightly to gaze at the crinkles around Hinata's white eyes and back again to look at Suzuki's. "I hope your journey was comfortable." "Imeo." It was as comfortable as it could have been given the rising mist, Suzuki said and took out a scroll from his pocket. "Take this to the Mizukage. Everything is arranged." He shoved his hands into the pockets. It was a bit chilly out here. "Yes," Ao said and looked over his shoulder. He threw the scroll over to a much younger man who carried a very large sword on his back. It was hard to imagine that man standing stiff on 2 thin legs, but he made a long leap and disappeared out of sight, an impossible feat for a man of his short stature. "I've arranged the rooms for your stay and the breakfast." "It would be." "No need," Suzuki interrupted. "Most of my squad members would stay outside the village for everyone's safety. Matters have been delicate with other villages. It's in everyone's interest if things went along smoothly here." He blinked and turned off the Sharingan. Now his eyes looked murky black in the mist. "I understand," Ao said, gazing at the other members and narrowing his eyes. He pulled the patch over the eye that had the stolen Byakugan and looked at Suzuki. "I'll arrange the tents and food for the rest of your team." Suzuki turned around. "Niji, you stay behind with the rest. I'll send Hinata out if I need anyone else," he ordered and moved his eyes over everyone. He stopped them momentarily on Sakura's pink face. She had not forgiven him for his sharp tongue. Her face worked with anger, accustomed to such mechanisms. Leaving them behind, he followed Ao into the mist with Hinata. His eyes had not deceived him. The village was beautiful. Bubbling brooks and streams moved over slick and mossy stones stuck deep in the bed. An assortment of nature's watery tricks made everything sound musical. Sun was sluggishly climbing up to the horizon. Its rays shimmered on twisting streams, so much so that every droplet danced like pearls. Even the mist shone as it broke away under the sun's ascent. They stopped at the open iron gate of a large house. 2 burly guards stood outside the double door. "These are your guest rooms," Ao said and gestured the guard to open the heavy door. "I've arranged for breakfast and warm water. The other rooms are still available if any other member of your team decides to stay here." Suzuki looked up at the cage's office. It overlooked the entire village and stood tall between 2 waterfalls. Dense fog piled up at its pillars. It looked as if it was floating over clouds. "Time of meeting?" Suzuki asked, keeping the fatigue buried under his calm countenance. "We need to get it out of the way as soon as possible before we can discuss the Chunin exams. It's all been arranged. I'll send over Kojuro at noon. He'll escort you to the Mizukage's office," Ao explained and adjusted his thick patch as if revealing it before a Hyaga could be taken as a sign of shame. Suzuki did not say anything and made his way inside the house. Hinata walked behind him. The inside was spacious and beautiful, warm and cozy. This house must have been used for political guests. Hinata scanned the entire area for anything unusual but found nothing. "Suzuki-sama, she whispered, puffing from the long hall to this house. There's nothing here." Suzuki raised his hand to silence her. "Go and rest. They'll call us by noon," he said and left her standing there in the hallway. One of the guards stood outside his room. He stepped inside and closed the sliding door. It was a warm room, large and lavishly decorated. Suzuki felt as though he was transported to his family house in the northern part of the Fire Country. A traditional watercolor painting hung inside the alcove, and a warm brazier was placed on an intricately crafted mat. He looked over to the paper screen and sunlight spreading shadows of trees on the wooden walls. A large breakfast was set out on a low table, right next to the sunken fireplace. A plume of mist rose from the pot's mouth. The tea was still warm. Suzuki closed his eyes and sat down on the cushion. It would be quite a while before the Mizukage would call him for the meeting. These were just the perks of being a dictator of the village. He smiled to himself and poured out tea. Noon came quite fast, sun hung low over the village. Most of the mist was gone and left behind little traces of white that still hovered by the buildings. Suzuki sat inside the Mizukage's personal office, with Hinata. The room was large and opened into a traditional garden. A well stood in the tall grass. Whenever wind blew, a whistling sound escaped its mouth. It led somewhere, or, perhaps, it was empty? He could not say for sure. It was not in good shape due to years of inattention. Voices traveled into the sitting room, and a moment later, a woman in a blue dress made her way into the room. She had long red hair and intense eyes which possessed the color of neem's young leaves. She was young, around early to mid-30s, he imagined, and quite pleasing to the eyes. Suzuki stood up when she looked at him with her mischievous eyes. "Ah, Uchiha Suzuki," she said with a musical lilt to her voice. "You of the Uchiha have such handsome faces." She laughed and tapped her finger on the painted lips. She was a little flirtatious, Suzuki thought. Her comment was strange for an official, but Suzuki managed a smile in reply. "Your village is beautiful," he said and glanced at the sparse mists drape over the straggling town that spread out north where a river began. "Perhaps we should keep you here, as well, because I don't think this village is as beautiful as you," she said, still playful, eliciting a little laugh from Suzuki and a frown from Hinata. Next to her, Ao and Kojuro looked quite embarrassed by their cage's brazen attempts at flirting with an official guest. Ao cleared his throat loudly and spoke, "Mei-sama, this man is here to discuss that grave Hyuga matter. Do not interrupt." "I'm aware," she said sternly with a wave of her hand and sat down on the fluffed-out cushion. Seeing her knit forehead, Ao bit his own tongue and silenced himself. It was for the best as Mei's temper flowed faster from her pretty mouth than lava. "So the Hyuga matter? You don't think it's a little too late to dig up old skeletons, Suzuki-kun?" She licked her lips and wiped away the lipstick smudge that wandered just outside her lips. She was a very kittenish woman, something which required no further convincing. "Old skeletons," Suzuki repeated and settled himself down opposite Mei. "Was this matter handled by Yagura-sama?" At his question, blush faded from her face. She looked away for a fleeting moment and then returned her gaze to his face again, looking impatient. "Yagura-sama." She paused and gathered her courage to speak. He was made a Mizukage at a very young age. Many poor decisions came from being sidelined as a young man that housed the demonic essence. "I'm sure this matter's no secret to Konoha that we meddled with it, as well." She cupped her chin, thinking over what to say next on this slippery matter. Suzuki's lips were sealed tight. He listened intently. Could it be that Root was involved in this matter, too? It was too early to tighten the noose around Danzo's neck. He needed more, so he stayed quiet in hopes of finding something from Mei's words woven too carefully, came from her lips. She gave him the impression of an actor, one which was almost convincing, but not quite. "During war," Mei continued and kept her gaze fixed on Suzuki, "many died, and to shore up our defenses, we took what we could from scenes of carnage. That Byakugan was one such gift left in the wake of the last Great War. Konoha has many, too." A ghostly smile played about her lips as she waited for Suzuki to say something. "Are you justifying something that could escalate into a political conspiracy and spark a war between the two villages?" Suzuki asked, and his expression hardened at the riddle weaved by her. He had no time for her demmed games. "Of course not," she said quickly and placed her hand on the low table in front of her. "I'm telling you the reason why the eye was even kept. There's nothing suspicious behind it. Your officials worry without a reason. Someone like me can't afford reasons that border on lofty ideals no matter how much I want it. All of us are bound to the system, even you," Suzuki said and immediately narrowed his eyes. "All I need is some proof that the clan from my village was never involved. I don't see any reason to lend my ears to your political matters. It'd only make matters worse. I doubt you'd want that." "Uchiha Suzuki," Ao broke in with a harsh accent, "you're speaking to the Mizukage. Show some. It's all right, Mei said, silencing him. You're honest and flexible. I love lissom men. I will help you, but on one condition. She stopped and ran her teeth across her lower lip and put up one finger. You won't ask for any matter concerning the exploits of war that go beyond Ao's prized possession. They don't concern you as you said yourself. You can only concern yourself with proving the Hyuga clan's innocence. Do we have a deal? Your conditions are steep, Suzuki said in a low voice, thinking. If she did not say anything more, there was little room to get something out of her about Root. It was a dead end for now. But it seems like a fair bargain. As long as the clan is saved from shame, the rest doesn't concern me. Then it's settled, Mei said and created a smile that was somewhere between anxious and bold. You two can stay here in my house to see documents from the previous Great War, and the rest of your team can stay in the other house. We have many guard shinobis that prowl at night. You need not worry about pesky shinobi thugs. Suzuki nodded and got to his feet when Mei stood up. I have some official matters to attend. I suggest you wait till nightfall for anything else on the matter. You're aware that very few people know about this situation. I don't want this to be a public affair. You must have treated it in the same manner. It was the wish of the clan's head. I'm just honoring it, Suzuki said and turned his eyes just a little to look at Hinata, who was twiddling her thumbs again. Mei smiled and left the sitting room with her guards. Suzuki turned on his Sharingan to look through the walls. It was safe for them to talk. Make sure you go through everything thoroughly. We won't get another chance. Make it count, he whispered and walked out of the sitting room. Hinata's eyes followed his every step till they could no more. She looked outside at the garden and then lifted her gaze skyward. Sun was red in the sky. It was strange how she was thrown in the midst of this all. What if nothing came out of this meeting? Her heart forgot several beats, and she felt tears on her cheeks. She stifled a sob and clutched at her breast. The thought pained her. Hinata blinked and stared at the scrolls with tired eyes. Her back was deeply bowed as she examined a large pile of official scrolls arranged before her, exploits of war, the equipment used, the number of lost men, obituaries of the fallen, the medics who aided in many ways, and the men who abandoned the war and were put to death as punishment. It was all here. The 3 candles on the table before her waned, their flames rising high on the blackened wicks. She would have to change them again soon. She inhaled sharply, feeling helpless. She had rummaged and rifled through more than half of them. Suzuki helped decipher most of the important scrolls written on political matters concerning the Byakugan. She checked all of them word for word, the dates, the people killed, and the people who died in her clan at the hands of Mist Shinobi. Her precious clan. An emptiness engulfed her. This was when her clan lost its strength and, perhaps, its honor. Hinata's nimble fingers moved over each line of another scroll spread out on the large table. She shifted in the chair, her legs dangling over the floor. She was not that tall a woman. There was a strange insignia next to the Byakugan symbol on the scroll she was reading now. She did not recognize it. Perhaps it was something the Mist Village's coders used for secret messages? A tall shadow loomed from behind, and she instinctively turned her head to look over her shoulder. It was Suzuki. He stepped into the candle's light. Half of his face was covered by the room's overwhelming darkness. He looked at the sky beyond the window and then steered his gaze towards the clock. Then his hazy lips moved to speak, "You're still here." Hinata looked ahead and rolled up the scroll. She had read through it. She fumbled for words as usual and held the scroll firmly between her hands. "IW was going through this one, Suzuki-sama. It's got this strange symbol I don't recognize. Do you know what it is?" She stretched her arm and gave the scroll to Suzuki. Suzuki unrolled it, not caring that the long paper fell down to his feet. He ran his eyes quickly over the page and caught sight of the symbol. A familiar look of realization flashed in his eyes before it disappeared. He rolled it up again and gazed down at Hinata. "I don't think it's of any concern. You can check the rest tomorrow," he said and threw the scroll on the pile that lost its shape as some of them fell down to the floor. "I'll call in you. He'll copy the important ones. If necessary, Niji can." "No." Hinata cut him off in a loud voice, quickly getting to her feet. "Don't tell anything to Niji and I. He shouldn't know anything about this. Please, I beg you. She clasped her hands together and hunched her shoulders pleadingly. A few thin lines momentarily creased Suzuki's forehead. He kneaded his brow for a moment and then opened his night-lured eyes to meet hers again. His entire appearance had marked itself permanently in her gaze, eyes, face, limbs. They made desire house itself firmly into the heart. She remembered again. In the darkness of many nights, the burning coals, and the cooler young blood in her began to simmer without shame. Look, he began in a softer tone and placed his hand on the table. I understand you don't want Niji to know anything about his family's involvement, but if this gets out of hand, Niji and everyone in your clan would be shamed. You should understand that. I don't want Niji in this mess, but if it can't be handled by me alone, I'd have no choice but to take him into confidence. This isn't a game. That sudden rise in desire went out quickly. Hinata lifted her eyes a little, peering through her hair, head bowed. She did not want him to see her face that was streaming with tears. She remained quiet and fought back the sobs and nodded slowly, when she felt that he was looking at her to say something in response. Take these scrolls to your room. Never mind, Suzuki said and shook his head, I'll ask you to carry them for you. Sleep tight. Don't let anyone bite. He pushed his hands into the pockets and left the room. The large door remained open, its steel catching the full moon's light. What a beautiful night. Hinata wiped her face on her sleeves and gestured you to take the scrolls to the room upstairs. He grabbed all the important ones, curled his arms around them, and made his way out. She was staying there for the night, but she wanted to meet Naruto. Maybe he would sleep in the same bed with her tonight, the way husband and wife did. He had been training tirelessly for the whole day. She looked at the clock hanging on the wall in front. It was just past 1 a.m. An optimistic smile forced itself on her lips, spring's little trick, and she ran out from the room. She was being a fool. She strode past the front door, playfully jumped over the stones that made the pathway, stepped onto the bridge over a stream. Naruto was standing there, his elbows on the handrails whilst he looked down to the water that flowed just below the bridge. Holding her breath, she took slow steps over to him. The wooden bridge creaked under her timid steps. She put her hand on the cold handrail and looked at Naruto's face. He was lost in thought, staring down into the darkness hanging over the water beneath. The lamp post close to them flickered, its bulb fizzling, and a swarm of insects flew round it. Its light had grown weak. The wind was light, and she could only hear a whispery shush of leaves now. She moved her white hand a little closer and tilted her head to look into his blue eyes, which gazed into the empty space before him. Naruto-kun, are you all right? She asked and watched as he turned with a start. A grin broke out on his sober face, and he scratched his head the way he always did when he was nervous. What are you doing out here? He asked and patted her head twice as though she was a child. It's cold out here. Look at the mist, it's rising. I can't even see my own hand. He raised his hand, waved it a little, breaking the mist into a zigzag pattern. She put her hand to her breast and her heart fluttered. A blush appeared on her cheeks, and she turned her head a little to hide her shyness. I came to check up on you, she said and lowered her eyes to look at the water, too, as though, like Naruto, it demanded her attention. Naruto took in a loud intake of breath, puffed out his breast, and exhaled loudly. Beneath the lamppost's broken light, she saw his eyes clearly. He had such deep ocean blue eyes. It brought out a different kind of feeling from her. Suzuki's eyes were dark, foreboding, distant, almost sinister, almost bewitching. They drew curiosity out of the other, to peel away veils of pretend play from them. She did not think she was ever successful. His eyes were very beautiful, deliciously seductive, but they were also cold and dangerous allure to draw someone in. Naruto was different, his eyes, warm. He was not a good-looking man, but she loved him for he was a thoughtless, blundering man full of hope. He was almost 25 but still innocent like little boys. She remembered that Suzuki often mocked him for being too naive when he came to their house. Naruto would only laugh in response. He was a simple man and he had simple dreams. Hinata clenched the fingers of her right hand. His dreams did not have enough room for her. Unlucky, perhaps. I came to talk to Suzuki, he said, breaking into her thoughts, but Ao said he'd already gone to bed. So I guess, I came here. I wanted to get a little fresh air. He raised his hand and took a whiff from a sakura flower, held delicately between his thumb and forefinger. He breathed in deep and closed his eyes as he relished the smell of the petals, whose delicate nature was a little dream between his fingers. Turning to her, his eyes twinkled in the light. There was a broad smile on his face. He looked happy now. That flower calmed his senses. He did not seem to see the shock appear on her face. "I'll see you tomorrow, Hinata," he said, still smiling, and walked away from her. He took a few slow steps, and darkness swallowed him. Light from the lamp was not strong and bright enough to cut down the fog that was dark as ink clouds in water. Hinata pulled her eyes away. She had no desire to turn on her Byakugan to look at him and see if he really was as naive and innocent as Suzuki believed him to be. She clamped her lips together and swallowed the sob growing painfully in her throat. She knew he did not love her, but to see him carry around the flower that constantly reminded him of her was a dagger through the heart. There was nothing left to see here. She put her hand over her mouth, eyes burning, and, before she knew it, she was running up the stone pathway to the house on the cliff. Whilst running, Hinata slipped and grazed her knee badly. Blood came out of the broken skin. It burnt, but she did not care and scrambled to her feet as though she was being chased down by a madman. Finally, she stopped running and breathed in loudly a couple of times to even out her breathing. She slumped exhausted over the fountain and made a scoop of her shivering hands. She splashed her face repeatedly and finally caught her wind. The last sob shook her, a child deep in sleep before the chill of fresh water made it feel like a passing daydream. The feeling vanished, and she felt that she had completely died inside. Naruto did not love her. The thought finally made a shaky home in her breast, and her heart beat no more even if she thought of the memory again. Listlessly, Hinata dragged her feet inside the house and closed the heavy door behind her. She squashed her back against the closed door for a few minutes and breathed in the aroma of incense in the sitting room. Few gray swirls still lingered about. She found her senses again and breathed in and out ritualistically and struggled to throw the thought out of her system, but the memory clung to her mind, a swollen leech, drinking her sanity, emptying her of the last bits of honor left in her. Her head spun around, like an impassioned dervish, and she flung herself to her right to break her fall. She sank down to her knees and then pulled herself stubbornly back up again. Her ears rang with Sakura's and Naruto's laughter in the forest yesterday, the harsh sounds of his breaths on the bridge when he sniffed at the flower. He had betrayed her, shamed her, dashed her honor to pieces. Their marriage was nothing but a prison for her. There was a menacing silence all around, but her ears pricked up at the faint sounds. Her mind loved the distraction and she chased after them. Suzuki. That was all that whirled in her mind. She wanted to find him. Eyes searched, and body yearned. For him. What a fool to be this way. She did not care. It was her wish, a little desire. She stopped by the large door that led to Mei's room. It was slightly ajar. She hid herself behind it like a child and peered at the back of the room. It was a sitting room attached to the bedroom. Faint sounds wafted to her through the half-open sliding door. There in the room stood Suzuki in black trousers, without anything covering his torso. His body's sleek lines were well punctuated by the glow from an orange lantern sitting on the side table. He was roughly pushed against the wall by Mei, who stretched on tiptoes to place kisses on his neck. He buried his fingers in the waves of her hair and bent down his head to cover her lips with his. She responded eagerly, pulling him closer as though he was a toy. He pulled down the net dress she wore and helped her step out of her gown that crumpled by her feet. Mei stood almost naked, gripping Suzuki's shoulders. He buried his face into the flesh of her neck and moved his hand up between her thighs to cup her genitals through her underwear. Hinata's heart leapt and her fingers gripped the door's handle tightly, palms slick-kenning with sweat, breath catching in her throat. She pressed her hand to her breast and kept looking, unburdening herself of Naruto and his memories, their tiny memories. It was shameful to look at this free show, this exhibition of lust, but what she felt for him made it easier to throw away reason and enjoy the spectacle before her. It was as though he had arranged it just for her, asking of her to join him in the old dance. For decadence, for pleasure, one which she fled from. So she watched as Mei lay on her back on the large bed, naked. Her body covered with sweat. Suzuki kissed her breasts and his hands played with her thighs. He moved lower and lower. Hinata felt the sticky wetness at the junction of her own legs. She felt warmer, her face, red, and blood crackled in her veins. Her heart, loud that she thought someone might hear it beat, that it would burst if it beat any faster. Hinata clenched her fingers into a firm fist, shaking, watching as he kissed her wet core. A moist flood appeared on her inner thighs. She was getting a vicarious thrill out of watching him pleasure her. She wanted him to do this to her, make her feel something, a spring for her heart's autumn. Mei's lips parted with a moan, her back arching off the mattress, whilst Suzuki continued to kiss her between the thighs. She stretched her arm and played with his messy hair that was spread out over her pinking thighs. Hinata shook all over and her vision blurred and her ears filled with a static sound, spirit, numbed by it all. Something ached between her legs and it hurt, and she thought that the only thing that would end it was to be filled by him. She pressed her hand down hard on her lips, enjoying the scene, thinking that she was there beneath him, waiting for him to complete her. The dull pain there was intensifying in a manner that it felt as though it was steadily soaring to a crescendo, waiting for something to overwhelm it. Suzuki pushed himself inside her and moved roughly. The last bit of will left Hinata as she watched Mei wrap her legs around his waist. She moved back and ran to her room. She did not stop till she made it safely inside. She closed the door, locked it securely, fearing that someone saw her standing outside the door. Hinata fell down onto the bed and buried her red face in the folds of the new bed sheets. Her heart continued to beat loudly before it finally found its right pace again. That silly mind continued to play everything over and over again. No matter how hard she tried, she could not bring up Naruto's memory. It got buried underneath the new one her body was growing fond of. Minutes passed, and when her body finally felt the chill coming in from the window upon itself, she rolled onto her back. Her eyes looked to the ceiling, and she moved her hand over her genitals and pressed it down a little. It was still throbbing there, but the pain was gone. She gulped down the air in the room and closed her eyes, and as if something had exhausted her, sleep had her in its clasp almost immediately. Suzuki lay under the warm sheets, with Mei next to him. He opened his eyes, the red in them tearing up the darkness in the room. His Sherry-non had fooled her so easily. Chapter 7, The Turn of Gears. Without any thought in mind, Suzuki's eyes opened, the red there fought against the surging gray in the room. Turning his gaze, he noticed an owl behind the weighty branches covered in the most supple, fresh green leaves. He saw its life force very clearly. Next to him, Mei was curled up like a caterpillar in a cocoon, sleeping peacefully with heavy sheets lying over her body. A map of sweat, along with the bite marks he had left, covered her freckles-dotted pinkish skin. Just next to the bed, the flame inside the lantern guttered on the wick. The oil in the lantern was nearly gone, and so was the blue splash in the room. It would go out in minutes. He knew it. Suzuki inhaled the odor from their conjoinings, still heavy in the air, getting a bit hard at the prospect of going for another round. There will be another time, he thought and smiled to himself. He would not lie, Mei was the most beautiful woman he had ever slept with. What a waste to go near her just once. It was easy to conquer her, almost too easy, he feared. All he had to do was give in to her girlish seductions, and there she was, not a moment later, vulnerable and pliant in his arms, fragile before the illusions. Down and down she fell, trapped in the narcotic scent of dreams the red wove. He needed to be close to the well. It was obvious, Mist was ruled by a foolish coquette. Suzuki pushed the sheets back and got out of bed. He skittered his gaze around the misty area beyond the room. The halls were empty, Hinata was fast asleep in her room, and 2 guards were right outside by the brook off yonder. That was easy, almost too easy? Something did not feel right, but he had no choice. Leaving empty-handed was not an option. He had not come all this way for nothing. Act now, think later. Was not the best of him, but it was for the best right now. Sage, damn it. He bent down and wore his sandals and picked up the jacket he had taken off few hours ago. All the tools he needed were still inside. He checked them one last time and opened the window. A wave of silver came crashing against the room. Overhead, sky flashed with intermittent bursts of the whitest light. It would rain again, and this time, it would come down harder. Suzuki placed his hand on the window pane and jumped out. He closed the window behind him and flashed up to the empty well. Its mouth was gaping open, and a whistling sound rose up from its dry depths. It was not a very long drop. Quickly, he scanned the area and leapt down to the stone-covered bottom. He landed smoothly on the gritty ground and ran south, following the tortuous path ahead. It was dark, but Sherinon was enough to guide the way. The path under his feet was mostly dry, but thin trickles of water ran down the narrow roof that was nothing but rocks and gnarled roots overhead. The passageway was dark, cramped, smelled earthy. Suzuki's ears pricked up at the sounds of rushing water. Just as he had thought, the well led straight out of the village, a safe passage to hide the cage and important officials when all was lost. When the sound of water rose to a melodious peak, Suzuki knew he was close as he drew near the cave's white and foggy mouth. Light came in through the twisting roots, and a lake lay quiet beyond them. Its surface was slightly ruffled by the wind. Waves rolled in, calm and pristine. Moving the roots out of the way, Suzuki stepped into the light. He bent his head and looked down into the lake's depths, eyes carving a visible path into the murky layers with ease. There it was, the secret entrance to the hidden underground hideout. He stepped onto the water, looking up, feeling the night air on his face. Breathing in sufficient air, he stopped the chakra supply to his feet and plunged down. A powerful shudder ran through him. The surface above him rippled, carrying frothy white foam and bubbles, the darkness below, a watery abyss. He swam downwards and kept his gaze locked on the two large Buddha statues and a big sacred stone wedged between them. Suzuki stopped, floating alone amidst the darkness. He leaned his head back and watched as the tender whites gave way to the black that came up from the deep, which rose in surges from what was below. The last shaft barely caught the side of his face, silver in his right eye. He moved his hands and feet and swam ahead, looking at the chakra threads that guarded the entrance like a crafty spider's web. He swam upwards and went through the space between the chakra wires. It was large enough for one lean man to swim through, probably for the guards who brought the scrolls and items here. Soon, he found himself in another cave system. These were underground caves. He could hold his breath for a good 30 minutes, but this was a bit risky. He had to be careful, or he would drown in here and leave a mess for his clan to clean up. The shame would haunt him in death. Lucky for him, Mist was a village full of fools. His Sherinon saw the residual chakra left by the ninjas. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs, too easy to see and track for his eyes. He saw the guards standing by the well late at night. They must have come here for the Hyaga scrolls, otherwise, the trail would have been lost in the water. Globules of chakra swirled about and glowed in the water in the manner of puffy little jellyfish. He looked at the space around him. It was illuminated by luminescent stones set deep in the pathways. When light passed through the bubbles, they shone as fine blue jewels. He doubted this place was constructed by the village. They must have found this place somehow. An underground shrine, he imagined, defiled by the greedy men of this village. Heretical. After swimming for a good 10 minutes, he finally found the mouth in the labyrinth of pathways. Any man without his eyes would have been lost. He rose up slowly, his face touching the surface, breaking the still water. He breathed in a lungful of air that was redolent of incense. Focusing his chakra under the feet, he pulled his body up and stood on the water's surface. Beneath him was the rising blue glow of smooth stones. Everything seemed worn out and decrepit here. Sacred statues had crumbled to dust and few others were missing various parts. Suzuki built up massive chakra and released a large wall of katon around him. It dried him off instantly. It was not wise to leave behind muddy sandal prints for Mist's intelligence division. They were fools, but no one was that foolish. A few stray droplets fell from his hair, but they were not large enough to create a noticeable trail. He placed his feet on the stone entrance and made a long leap straight for another large stone, covering the distance with ease. He did not want to leave any trace of his presence behind. After the third jump, he landed in a room with a few chambers. One of them was open. Lucky. The guards must have left in a hurry when he demanded the scrolls and made those accusations. Was it that easy to poke May into action and make her spread her lovely legs wide for him? A smile twisted his face. She was easy. Maybe. He stepped into the chamber, never leaving the anchor of confidence his eyes assured. There were chakra prints all over the trunk by his feet. The chakra was disappearing fast, evanescent, a fleeting scent. He knelt down and opened the trunk and looked inside. Strange, it was almost empty save for some scrolls stamped with the hidden leaf symbol. Did she divulge everything to avoid a possible war with Konoha? He was convincing. He looked through the scrolls and finally found something that interested him. The scroll bore Root Division's stamp, Danzo. He found more stamps on the scrolls piled neatly inside the old shelf. It was made up of dried bamboo. That was all he needed to build something up. The gears turned fast in his head. Suddenly, like forking branches of ink that grew in the paper from a little drop, a scheme emerged from the thought's depths, winding and twisting into a ripening plan that carried the tidings of Danzo's fate, summer's fruit, succulent, that awaited autumn's sun to enrich it with a rotting sweetness and grant it vengeance's ripe shade. All he needed were more pieces, and that man's heart, his rotten heart, was his. Sasuke took out some empty scrolls from his pocket and made quick hand seals and copied the words on the blank papers. They got covered with intricate patterns, and Danzo's fate was prematurely sealed. It would not be long before Mei woke up. He wanted to leave her in a pleasant illusion, without the nuisance of paralysis. Such tricks left bouts of mental and physical pain in their wake. He placed the scrolls exactly where they were before, then he rearranged them meticulously and left the exact way he came. When Mei woke up, her hand landed on Sasuke's breast. The trip back to the well was easy. It took him less than half the time to make it back before she came to, and the guards returned to check up on him and Hinata. She moved closer to him and pressed her lips to his, her tongue eager in his mouth. Clasping his arms around the small of her back, he pulled her close. The press of her breast against his flared his youthful loins almost instantly. He pushed Mei onto her back and pried open her thighs for another round. It did not take her body long to allow him to enter her again. When he touched her genitals, he felt the delightful seep of her moisture. He needed this more than she, so he enjoyed her thoroughly. When morning came, it was business as usual, just another day in his life that demanded that little change, that little excitement he craved. Mei provided it this time, but soon, she would begin to bore him. He was this way with Sake, too. When he tasted it once, he always liked something new to touch his lips next time. Swilling down the same thing every day made it trivial. He was quick to bore, hard to please, restless, but she was different, a feisty beauty, and he enjoyed tasting unique, strong Sake from time to time. Mei lumbered around rather awkwardly in her office. Her legs had a mind of their own. Her guards seemed to know a little too much, but that was her business. Her political affairs were none of his affairs. He looked around when Mei sat down cautiously on the mat opposite. Hinata was not here. Perhaps she overslept? Naruto and others are waiting. Ao's voice trailed off as he stole an embarrassed glance at his Mizukage. Outside the village. The supplies are ready. Thank you, Sasuke said and looked at Mei, whose face was whipped with worry and a delightful blush. I've given the Chunin examinations scrolls to Ao. He told me that you're satisfied with the arrangements. Yes, Mei said, cleared her throat, and covered her neck with a shawl, which hid the marks of her adventurous night. I'd like for your Hokage to consider 2 more officials from the water country. They've given funding for the Ninja Academy's improvement. It's only fair that they're invited. She held her gaze, her face scrunching into a scowl. And he did not know why. They had had a good time. Strange woman. It's not in my power to say anything on this matter. You can give me the official letter, and I'll hand it over to the Hokage. Then it's up to her to decide, he explained, looking at her pinking cheeks. She was searching for something in his face, but his expression was too calm to break under a woman's prying eyes, or so he assumed. Mei considered his statement for a moment. It seems appropriate, she said, her voice sweet and soft. When she would come to Leaf during the Chunin examinations, he would make sure to invite her to warm his bed. I've asked Ao to arrange for the letter. It should be ready in an hour. I've got to check up on Hinata. She's been feverish since last night, Sasuke said and got to his feet. Yes, of course, Mei said and rose up to her shaky feet. Her genitals were aching dully since last night. Would you like to stay here for dinner? I can't, Sasuke said and looked outside. I have to hand over the report to the Hokage as soon as possible. She gets pretty sore otherwise. With that, he left the living room. The sun rays were bright and strong when he reached Hinata's room. He made a firm fist and knocked. Silence. She was still sleeping. He knocked again and spoke, Hinata, it's time to leave. Unless you plan on staying here. Hinata's eyes opened suddenly, and her body convulsed with a strange excitement that still lingered in her. His voice stole its way over to her, and she knew she wanted him. The flesh was overjoyed by the spectacle she witnessed last night. She was trembling from the chill in the room. She had fallen fast asleep and remembered nothing other than his passions. "Hinata," came the voice from behind the door, and it sounded quite eerie now. "Are you awake? If you aren't feeling well, I can send in a medic. Sage knows I can't handle these monthly female troubles." "Why yes," Hinata said weakly and wrapped her arms around herself. The room was under the spell of morning cold. She looked at the fireplace. Only the last coal was burning in the pile. The smoldering flames would go out soon. "I'm fine." She slapped her feet onto the chilly wooden floor and swayed a little and balanced herself by gripping the bedpost. She reached out a trembling hand to the door and opened it quite unwillingly. Suzuki's expressionless face greeted her tired morning gaze. "You slept in?" Suzuki asked, as if talking to himself. Strange, how a woman that plays in the moors all day forgets to wake up. He turned and gave the door a little push and closed it behind him. Hinata's body felt the burden. His gaze was boring into her. She backed away and stood with her back against the wall. I was a little tired," she finally said, and dropped her gaze to her feet at the sight of Suzuki's eyes and a visible sheen of arrogance that hovered over them. "Where were you last night?" he asked, looking at Hinata's face that was sweaty despite the chill in the room. "I told you to stay in your room, but you wandered off. And peeped at things. How naughty." Hinata jerked her head up, eyes widening. Pink bled to white in her cheeks and lips. She looked numb, almost dead under the weight of embarrassment. "I didn't mean to. I am sorry, Suzuki-sama." "It won't happen again," she said, fumbling for words. Her lips trembled. Shame finally broke through her eyes, and fresh teardrops stood on her cheeks. Suzuki towered over her, his shadow solid on her and the wall. "Don't tell anyone," he whispered and contorted his features into a more serious look. "I mean it. What you saw doesn't concern you. There will be terrible consequences. For me and for you, if you did. Bury it deep in your heart and forget it. You will do us both good. Your family's honor depends on it." Then he moved back and gazed down at her as though he was waiting for her to say something. Hinata's nose was red, and she absent-mindedly fiddled with the bracelet around her wrist. She broke off and suppressed a noisy sob that came out as a whistle from her left nostril, adding to her shame. "That day, you told me to do exactly as you asked." "Why?" Suzuki narrowed his eyes, now red, and turned his gaze slightly to look at Ao walking up the path, a letter in his hand. "Yes," he said, after a long consideration, "you're easy to tease to see if you felt anything underneath this aloof wife act despite the discarded daughter affair, and the embarrassment it's brought you. What did you find when you rushed off to see Naruto?" He smiled at the sight of defeat in her eyes. She could not speak. "Your silence is enough. Play the game yourself. This is your chance to wash away the stain left on your clan's reputation by the Namikaze. What better way than to string the arrow of shame and drive it through Minato's heart?" "Minato, who arranged for this unfortunate marriage to save himself and his ruined name," he went on, voice heavy in the room that felt too small. "Whether you choose to strike the sleeping snake or not is your choice." Then he left the room without saying another word. Hinata remained silent, and her eyes traveled about her feet. Her ears buzzed with Suzuki's words even after he had left her alone in the room amidst the corroding silence. She was easy to tease, play with. Suzuki was right. Minato had poured this poison into her life. She had to fight back. Chapter 8, A New Leaf. A berry fell down from the tree in a cascade of dry leaves. Rotten to the core, it would never be able to sprout roots and grow into a tree and bear fruit in summer. It fell close to Suzuki's feet. He paid it no mind and continued to look at Naruto, trying his hardest to carry out a seemingly impossible task. Naruto clapped his hands together and made the usual sign that had become a cliché for him. He created 2 cage buns hens. In less than a moment, another equally confused Naruto popped into Suzuki's field of vision and smiled from ear to ear. It was always the same spectacle, but Suzuki was patient. Suzuki leaned his head into his hands, and his eyes drooped under the burden of yesterday's journey. It was the wee hour of morning, and night was just beginning to reveal a magnificent color on the horizon. The forest was still under the mantle of mist. It was a somber sight, pristine. He pulled his head back and held his gaze, waiting for Naruto to show him something, anything. Sometimes, it was a great struggle to take this man seriously. Wait. The original Naruto exclaimed and slapped his own forehead, I've got to make another one, and then he proceeded to create another clone. Naturally, Sasuke said in a sleepy voice. He intended to view this talent show in the evening, but Naruto had insisted. Sometimes, he wondered, were there any perks of being the head jonin of a team? The whole matter was a children's fairy tale, more myth, less fact. Finally, what felt like eons to Sasuke, Naruto held out his hands and faced his palms out, and the clones began making spinning movements over his palms. First, a Rasengan swirled into view, and then a new elemental chakra whirled around it. Both of them melded and conflated into a spinning, blade-like chakra formation. Sasuke craned his neck and tried to look interested. Naruto had done this before, but he never could maintain it for long, let alone throw it in any direction at whim. His noisy clones jumped back, and Naruto took a cautious stance, hunching his shoulders and moving his arm back to throw the spinning chakra at the rocks in front. Sasuke stood straight with a start, unfolding his arms, his eyes glinted with curiosity. Naruto threw his arm forward, and the chakra detached itself from his hand. It whirled forward and cut clean through the rocks in front. Sasuke's Sharingan flickered to life on its own, peered through the misty forest to look at the Rasen Shuriken cleaving the mist and trees before disappearing into thin wisps some 50 feet to the north. A subtle expression went across his face, and he brought his gaze back to Naruto. He was impressed. Not bad, Sasuke said and slapped the side of his thighs to rid his trousers of leaves. A bit late, don't you think? You're never pleased. Naruto said happily, wearing his trademark happy-go-lucky smile. How do you like that? Impressed, huh? He widened his eyes and kept that smile impeccably pasted on the face. Terribly, Sasuke returned and ceased his smile. That doesn't mean this wasn't long overdue. Stop slacking, that's all. He turned around and started walking out of the open field he had reserved for his team's training. Naruto jogged behind him and then slowed down his pace. Never mind. You look grumpier than usual. What's eating ya? He asked and scratched his head. Nothing that would concern you. Sasuke halted in his steps and returned Naruto's warm gaze with ferocious calm. You need to drop Sakura. She might get released from my service soon. I don't want you weeping on my doorstep like last time. Naruto's smile and face sagged more than ever, and his eyes swam with the usual concern. He looked miserable and desperate already. Why are you doing this? She might get transferred to another village in the fire country. You know I won't be able to see her that way. How can you do this? He pleaded, and his face convulsed with the burden of longing and distance. His emotions were almost palpable for Sasuke to bear. Sasuke closed his eyes, sighing. How long do you want me to entertain your little romance? He asked and met Naruto's lightest eyes with the heaviest intensity. This isn't a game anymore. You're not a child and neither is she. She failed her medical trials. I got the results just last night. On what grounds should I keep her? That you can't get enough of her? This isn't a good enough for me. Naruto bowed his head and clenched his teeth. You know I love Sakura-chan. You let her go and what's left for me? You don't understand. You never understand, he said and turned his face away, his voice affected by anger and bitterness. Sasuke put his hands on his face and breathed heavily behind the sweaty palms. When will you grow up? When? He asked, voice heavy, and pulled his hands down. You know this matter is big. Your family's reputation is at stake. Your reputation is at stake. I don't need to remind you over and over again. Why don't you understand? Why don't you listen? I don't want to let you off my team at the cost of Sakura. And Isama's just looking for a reason to discharge you. Don't make this harder for me than it already is. Naruto peered through the haze of resolve hovering over his eyes. His ears did not want to hear reason. I care about you, Sasuke. You're a brother I never had. And, he broke off and stopped the surge of emotion in his breast. No one can ever take your place, not even Sakura-chan, but I know you've never thought about me that way. Sakura. She sees me. You can't understand my feelings. Then he stared off into the distance. Sasuke remained silent, looking at the man sagging at his knees. He did not know how to answer. Naruto was infatuated with Sakura and felt this strange sort of pure love for him that he never understood. Naruto's confession always left him without words. He searched for them tirelessly, but when the right moment came to speak his mind, he lost them to uncertainty and silence. Nothing changed Sasuke's expression. He simply turned away and said, "Go home to your wife. Tell her that I want to talk to her about joining the team. I'll drop by in the evening. We'll talk some other time." Then he walked away and left Naruto behind in the clearing in the midst of a huddle of trees to fumble for words and thoughts. He had gone through this so many times. Naruto's words and eyes broke Sasuke's resolve. He did not know how to get rid of Sakura without hurting Naruto. It had to be done, something had to be done. "I don't need more distractions," Sasuke said, standing straight before the leader of the Hidden Leaf Village. Tsunade looked up from the scroll on her table. A large stack lay untouched next to her sake cup, a finely crafted white ceramic one. She rolled up the scroll with unhurried gentleness and clasped her hands together. "You don't seem to like her," she said in an accusatory tone that did not seem to affect Sasuke's ready-made expression. "I don't think this is just about the test." Sasuke let out an audible humph and turned his face away, not trying to hide the scornful smile that broke his expressionless face this time. "Is that what she told you?" he asked, letting his red burden her body and mind. "I'm aware that she's your student. Perhaps your feelings are affecting your judgment." "Don't be so direct, boy," Tsunade retorted, and her features contorted in anger. "You want diplomacy instead when only a moment ago you asked me to be candid," he asked slowly, grasping this moment of candor. "I'm not fond of the quaint customs of Leaf and the ready-made conveniences they offer, but I'm aware of my own rights as a head jonin. You forced her onto me when it was my choice to select any medic I saw fit." "Why?" Tsunade breathed in sharply, her jaws went tense, and her eyes remained transfixed on the red in his. They pulled her gaze to them, enchanting and mesmerizing, two specters, endless allure. Uchiha's myths of this world. "What are you trying to say?" Tsunade finally asked, and found herself straining to break completely free of the powerful eyes that seemed to swim in the room's darkness. "I made her stay with you because you had already appointed Naruto. A team that worked together as chonins would only strengthen itself as jonins. What other reason could I possibly have? Is that all?" Sasuke asked, bringing out that flare of anger on her face. She could be read so easily. "Whatever the reason, I don't want her on my team anymore. She's affecting Naruto's judgment, and his performance is falling apart because of her expensive paramour status. Didn't she tell you?" Sasuke feigned innocence and watched her with wicked sarcasm on his face. "What is this?" Tsunade stood up slowly, livid. "You'd go this far? I have no reason to ruin her common reputation. It's Naruto I'm worried about. Whatever happens to her is none of my concern. If this matter gets out, Naruto would be ruined. Namikaze's burden has already destroyed his reputation. When will you stop her when he drowns in all of this? Would that make you happy? I doubt you don't know about her little trysts." "Enough!" Tsunade shouted and slammed her hands down on the table. It cracked at the legs and started wobbling. She buried her face in her hands and stood still for a moment to get her wind. A few moments passed, and she finally moved her hands to look at him, staring at her impassively. "This isn't about Naruto, it's about you, isn't it? You're worried about your own reputation. Sakura would never go this far. I know her. You can never know another. And I don't care what you think of me. Honor isn't made overnight, nor can it be bought. It's precious and irreplaceable. You may not understand this, but I do. Half of my family was murdered for this village. Don't think I've forgotten. I won't let you ruin my honor. Either you put an end to this, or I will. This is the last time I've come to your office for this," he said in tone that he meant what he said, and walked out, not waiting for Tsunade to speak out in Sakura's defense. Tsunade slumped down into the chair. His accusations shook her. Her fingers trembled as she closed them around the sake cup. She brought it to her lips and took a few quick sips absent-mindedly. She was lost for words and had few thoughts to spare. She had brought up Sakura as if she was her own. She would never do something like this. Sasuke closed the door behind him, and his eyes immediately caught sight of Sakura standing by the pillar a couple of feet away. For some fleeting moments, he held his gaze and poured out the malice in his eyes. He did not say anything and left the corridor with stiff long steps. Sakura's eyes followed his every step till he disappeared behind the main door. Was the knight always here to hide away her unwanted wish? She closed her eyes, shutting out the world, and grief poured over her face. Naruto stood on his doorstep under the dark sky, raining. And the stone trail that left the front door was covered in wet. There was a stream by the side of his house, its stone bed was scoured out by cold water that came from the mountains. These stones were once carved out by the finest Konoha's craftsmen for his father. His family used to live here in the short summers and fleeting springs. Now, their outlines had diminished beyond recognition, worn thin. Like his father's honor. He bowed his head and his face trembled. Suddenly, he fell forward and hit his head on the hard wooden door. It's her fault. She did all this, the voice, clear and cunning, began ringing in the mind. If she wasn't here, you could have been free to do whatever you wanted. Naruto clutched at the handle feebly, his slick fingers slipping on the door. Look, she abandoned you today. Didn't let you play with her. Get rid of her. Then you can have Sasuke. You love him, don't you? You love him so much. He's dear to you. A family you never had, a brother you always wished for in the nights you wept. You forgot. I remember. Your mother and father have only made you miserable, haven't they? The voice resonated as if in an empty room and hit at the walls of his consciousness. Kill her. Kill this bitch. She's just a whore who's using you. You know this. She's always loved Sasuke, never you. You were useless, you are useless, you dead last. It laughed with wicked sincerity that hurt his heart, and the eyes glowed, serpentine in the darkness that spread and spread in the mind, rising from the bottom like a filthy sludge. Leave me alone. Naruto burst out, voice wobbling beyond his control. He trembled all over. A chill shot up his spine and froze him to the bones. It was that voice he was going mad again. He clutched at his heart as though it would stop beating if he did not. It pained him. Even his breaths burdened him greatly. He was being suffocated to death. Naruto parted his lips with an animalistic snarl, baring his teeth. His hands flew to his mouth. He tasted blood as new teeth moved inside his mouth, long canine teeth jutted out of his gums, and his eyes turned to slits. Get out of my head, he hissed, feeling detached from his human half. His backbone twisted underneath the skin, and he fell down onto his knees, cringing before a more powerful master unwilling. Run. Run. Run, the voice said in devious delight, tempting him, mocking him with the same intensity, run. 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 But you can't hide. Then it burst out into a hideous laugh and suddenly went silent. Naruto's vision focused on his hands caked in dirt. His head was bowed, and he was on all fours on the stone path. Cold wind blew up his shirt from behind. The strange sensation left him again, he was at its mercy. He mustered up the courage and wiped his dripping face on his sleeve. The rain was not stopping, why would it not stop? Putting his fingers in the sliding door's handle, he pulled himself up and rapped on the door. He did not hear anything before the door slid open and revealed Hinata. She looked shocked to see him home at night tonight of all the nights. Naruto-kun, she said as if questioning him, and held the door open as he stepped inside. He did not say anything and silently took off his sandals and marched off to their bedroom. Hinata slid the door shut and locked it from inside. She traced his steps and found him sitting beside the lamp on the floor, with the same lamp paintings scattered about it. The room was dim and bits of light shone on used paint brushes and glass bottles filled with water. She had finished painting one pattern before Naruto's knock came upon the door. This felt like something completely different from their usual routine. She kept looking at him, and he returned her gaze with the same empty eyes. Not saying anything. Feeling that she should say something, Hinata breathed in and parted her lips to speak, "Would you like some tea, Naruto-kun?" Naruto's eyes remained the same, but he moved his hand and tapped it lightly on the floor. She looked at him absent-mindedly, moving her gaze to and fro like a pendulum between the spot he touched and him. When he did not say anything, she moved her feet and slowly sat down beside him. There was nothing but silence between them, broken and sawed by the sounds from thunder and wind that hissed, 1,000 feverish snakes, their vibrating coils snarled up in a decadent frenzy of an old ritual. Suddenly, Naruto moved his hand and wrapped his arm around Hinata's waist and buried his face in her neck. At first, he breathed heavily, nuzzling against her neck, but then he opened his mouth and kissed her. His lips were parched despite the rain outside whilst he gently kissed her shoulder and moved his hand to touch her breast. He squeezed it gently and pulled her closer. Hinata was disgusted, her fingers trembled. His lips left a searing pain of betrayal on her spirit and it burnt, it hurt so much. To think that she was something he would entertain himself with when Sakura abandoned him. She was nothing but a toy in his arms, and she was through being his second plaything. When Naruto slipped his hand between her legs, Hinata pushed him back. Startled, as if some sort of haze had cleared from his mind, he pulled back, wearing a hurt expression on his face. He was still quiet, lips clamped shut as though sealing many of his secrets. His fingers clenched on the mat, and he turned his head away when his lips quivered, his countenance warped by humiliation. "Do I?" he said with an air of defeat. "Disgust you that much that you won't even let me come near you? I'm just tired." Hinata's voice trailed off, and she looked towards the paintings, pulling her kimono up to her neck as though to hide her skin from a man that was not her husband. "I bled last time when we tried. It just hurts. Maybe there's something wrong with me. I'd go and see Shizun-san about this." Both of them were silent. Naruto's head was hanging in defeat. He clenched and unclenched his fingers, feeling repulsed that she had rejected him again. Sakura did not want him and his own wife did not need his touch. Maybe it was right, that thing festering inside him like a tumor. It was eating away at his soul, his resolve, his self. He was becoming empty day by day. How long would it be before he would lose everything of himself before its evil? Tick-tock, tick-tock. He could hear its glee come over to this room. "No, no, no." He heard his own shouts shatter him from within, "But how could you get out of your own devils?" "Poor little sad little boy." The thought frightened Naruto, but that insidious malice unfurled again. He let it leak, overcome him this time. It held him in its clutches, entranced him. With extreme sluggishness, Naruto got to his feet. He staggered, limping a little to the left like a drunken man, but quickly regained his balance. He moved his hand through his hair and looked down. His eyes had lost that emptiness, and, now, they were topped to the brim with loathing, his sunny blues fading out. His lips twitched oddly as he looked at Hinata with contempt. His eyes were beginning to terrify her. "Sasuke wants to talk to you," he said with infinite calm, keeping the lid of resolve on his emotions that began to bubble and boil to the surface as if they existed in an aged cauldron. Hinata's eyes darted all around the room, her gaze elusive. "What does he? I don't know and I don't care. Who knows what he wants with the likes of you?" He cut her off sharply and left the room without saying anything else. Hinata scrambled to her feet and rushed behind him. "Naruto-kun," she called out and stopped close to the main door. "Where are you going?" "It's late and still raining. You should stay. At least, until the storm lets up." Naruto wore his sandals and threw open the door angrily. He stood there for a few moments in the wind, gritting his teeth. "Your purpose is to give me an heir for my family," he began after gulping in a solid breath full of storm's wind. "That's the only reason I married you. You and I both know that. The sooner you accept it, the better. Unless you want to shame your father that you can't even bear me children." "And Naruto-kun," Hinata breathed out and stared at him in disbelief. No matter how aloof he got, he never talked to her in this manner. He had never heard her with words. Sakura had ruined him, and she could not turn to her father for help as long as the dagger of conspiracy was hanging over her head. She was left swaying between the red daemon and the blue sea. Her lips trembled, and one sob shook her before she conquered the rest completely. "I don't want you to refuse me my right next time," he spoke from the door, his gruff voice carrying itself over the noise from outside. "No one would accept a barren woman if I left you." He cast her a hateful smile and closed the door behind him. The light burning in the room dimmed as wind rushed in. "A barren woman?" She asked the house that was her companion, voice shaking her, and fell back and hit the wall behind her. She stood there for several long minutes before her feet moved with slow movements. They met the floor as if having a mind of their own. Soon, her eyes found the familiar in the same room and the same paintings and the same brushes. Everything was the same, even her. Her make-believe pride finally crumbled to dust under Naruto's spiteful words. Their truth rang louder this night. Yes, her father had cast her away to save his name. Did he know about the conspiracy? Did he marry her off to save their family's names? She slumped down to the floor, and, slapping her hands against her cheeks, she cried hoarsely. She was trapped in a limbo with a man who did not want her, and there was no way out. She could not leave. Where would she go? Who would claim her? Where would she find solace? She was useless, more useless than Naruto would ever be. He did not know how lucky he was. At least, he was wanted. Hinata's sobs convulsed her whilst she tried desperately to regain control, breathing in and out in quick bursts to calm her breaths, but tears kept coming, shaming her that she was no better than a woman cast out from a clan to bear an heir for another. She put her head between her knees and let out all the grief behind the leftover shards of girlish dreams' innocence. She had nothing left. She was born to save the names of 2 clans. "Hinata," said a voice that came from beyond the room, followed by soft steps on the floor. The voice carried itself to her on wind rushing in and out of the house from underneath the doors and little spaces round the windows. This house was so noisy tonight. Hinata flicked her head up and wiped her face clean on the long sleeve. The voice began to tear away at the cold that clung to her like a leech. Slowly, it scraped off the unwanted feeling from her body and filled her up with such warmth that her slow heart picked up the pace. She would recognize this voice anywhere. "Sasuke," she whispered without the barrier of honorific, throwing off the burden of Naruto's hurtful words from her body with stubborn haste, and looked towards his shadow that stretched long and wide on the wall in front. Within a moment, Sasuke came into view, a silhouette against the bright light in the corridor. He turned his head and stepped into the room and stopped just a step short of her. "You're sitting here?" he asked, moving his head around to look at the room, stopping his gaze just for a moment on the unfinished paintings spread out on the matted parts of the floor. "Naruto's sleeping at the academy tonight." "I don't know why, but that's not why I'm here." "He didn't tell you?" Hinata kept staring at him and wrapped her arms around herself. "No," she said in a tiny voice, not averting his gaze. "I want you to join my squad. I think another Byakugan user would be good. That'd take the burden off Niji, and I'd get another helping hand. I don't want to press you on this, but I accept." Hinata said loudly and jumped to her feet to look at his face clouded by mild confusion. "I accept, Sasuke." Sasuke tilted his head a bit to one side, slightly taken aback by a direct use of his name, especially from Hinata, but he did not say anything after taking a good look at her face. She had been crying. "All right," he said and ran his eyes over the dry streaks that crossed her cheeks. "You can come by my office tomorrow morning. I'll train you to control your chakra. You told me it was your weakness." "Yes," she said through the haze on her mind, her countenance slowly taking on the look of a wish-bearer. She wanted Naruto to suffer, her father to pay for his distance. It was always Hanabi, never her. Why should she anchor the name of their families alone? Defiantly, she threw away the burden wrought by honor, name, duty. She would feel love, passion, freedom. She would taste them the way they all did day in, day out. "I'll see you tomorrow. Get some rest," he said and turned towards the door when Hinata grabbed his hand. Sasuke looked back at her with a start. He saw the hard resolve on her face, and then lowered his eyes to her fingers that gripped his hand. He closed his eyes and smiled a meaningful smile. "This is a mistake. I don't think this is the way to get back at Naruto. Stay here with me," Hinata said in a strong voice that surprised even her. Her bold expression remained plastered over her face. She did not waver as she kept looking into his eyes in the room's dimness, gripped by the need for passion. He would be the new leaf in her life's book, a new beginning. Everyone started from somewhere. Suzuki remained silent, meeting her white eyes with a calmer design of lust. He felt as though he was being fooled. He never expected Hinata to let slip these words from her lips. Naruto really had pushed her to her limit. It was almost pitiful, it was almost too easy. "I don't want you to leave," she said, voice laced with the depths of such passion that he felt that familiar male itch. She moved her hand up and touched the zip on his jacket and pulled it down gently. Her timid demeanor, corrupted by the newness of lust, was quite the sight to behold. That he bent his head down and took her lips, and she welcomed them without hesitation. Chapter 9, It began with a mistake. Mistakes, what were they like? How many had she made to twist away from her little piece in fate? She could not recall having made many to earn her freedom. A dreadful sound cut through the lust, but it was not enough to stop her. She wanted him terribly. His touch made streaks of joy run to the heart that shuddered with incautious rhythms. The moist flood increased between her thighs whilst her questing tongue traced his lips, and as he parted his mouth, she tasted his. It was warmer against hers than her eyes, like a moth caught in a whirlwind. There was a fleeting taste of sake on his tongue and something else, and she drank the breath from his body. Sweet, he was very sweet. She wanted more. That dull ache intensified to a sharper pain, and she wanted him to fill her. Every barrier of shame was gone, every memory, forgotten behind passion. Her mind was fettered only by body. Her timid heart, which was often slow to catch on, was stirred violently to a hot fever. Veins throbbed with a heavy pulse, blood pounded in her ears like drums rowdy children played with. Her skin was warm and sweaty, and when the cool draft of wind slid across it, it became another sensation that whirled her blood and mind. Hinata was helpless. Hopeless. She realized that. With trembling hands, she had slid off his office jacket. It lay somewhere by her feet. She did not care where it was. Her unsure hands struggled again with his shirt. She had just grabbed the shirt's corner when he pulled it over his head and threw it away. A thin film of sweat covered his white skin, and she felt it tingle with arousal underneath her fingers. His skin, she noticed, was much too white that her hand's color looked dull against it. It was not a slow dance she had imagined. No, Suzuki was fiery, his touch demanding, forceful, quick, his teeth grating on her lips. His breaths came fast and heavy, and when they blew across her slick skin, all the unwanted wants, unfinished pleasures, unnamed dreams mingled into a single sensation that went trembling to her bones like a vibrating pulse. She had never felt this before, a stranger thing. At that moment, nothing mattered, no one mattered. She wanted him to complete her, shatter the deeply nurtured chill in her body, break her like a toy, make her whole again with nothing but strings and threads of joys unfelt, stitch that doll back up again, rip its spirit out with one pleasurable jab of a needle that would bleed her out. She would act in the pretend play of virgins to relieve the last disappointing memory through him this time. When you dreamt in fairy tales, you hoped for things to come true. This new sensation would not ease. She wanted his lips back on her, but when they met his, she knew that hers were clumsy like her. Every bit of her was clumsy. His answer was a rough, feverish kiss. He was not gentle. He nipped at her lips and let out a deep, breathy sound that rushed across her skin. His hands moved down, and he hastily undid the obi tied around her waist. He yanked at her kimono and it slid down in a heap by her feet. Her underwear followed. Her hand was tight in his hair, her teeth at his earlobe, as he lay on her and wedged his hips between her legs. She arched up against him, breast heaving, eyes swirling. She moved her fingers around his heaving ribs, into the dip of his sweaty spine, and about the contours of his arms and that face. He was beautiful, bewitching, breathtaking. That heated expression granted him an intense countenance, which had mesmerized her thoughts in many a lonely night. Hinata did not need any words. She did not think she even had them. It was all wordless lust and wonder bits in fairy tales. Her timid gestures to draw him closer matched the expressions on her face. She felt his heart through her palm. It was loud and wild and quick. The aching pain increased. It was unbearable, and she felt it clench repeatedly against nothing. Pressing into him, she smelled him, the heady musk from his body. In her confused mind, she listened to the crashing sounds of his heart as if it was made of something heavy and metallic and being thrown repeatedly against the wall, an assortment of dull sounds, rising from the depths, becoming louder and louder, unendurable. Her whole body felt as though it was violently crashing against the rocks, only without the pain, only without the unpleasantness. The feeling. It was breaking her apart. She wanted it to begin, let it start somewhere and overcome her with violence. She was ready. She had surrendered. Her body, now, was a hopeless meld of lust and longing. He entered her in one rough shove. A cry burnt in her throat. She opened her mouth to utter it, but nothing came out other than a whimpering sound. It hurt. A little. It was all so sudden. She felt full, almost wanton when he moved. His thrusts were quick, deep, powerful, and then they were hard, harsh, rough. She went into a frenzy, undulating with the rhythms he had to offer, pleasure singing in her body, swirling in her bosom, her walls pulsing around him. Hinata did not want him to stop. She wanted him to ruin her spirit with all the violence he could manage, let nothing of the old remain, let it rot somewhere like this house rotted away and Murs leave her wanting. It was a silly thought, but she was not afraid to admit it, not to herself. She felt herself edging closer to the abyss from their mating vibrations as he unkindly propelled her body forward on the bed. She tightened her walls with each stroke, and he made a pained sound, his head bent and eyes closed shut whilst he braced himself over her. His breaths were frantic, hot, and ragged, against her ear. His thrust so deep that her calm broke. Her breath got knocked out of her. Her eyes became larger, and her mouth opened wide with wonder, and she erupted, tightening painfully around him. His neck strained in response, his face twisted in pleasure, and he stroked one last time and pulled out and sprayed over her belly. Whatever that feeling was, it went through her and she was spent, a pleasure she had never known before. It tingled her skin and burned her lungs with a cool fire. Every breath that occupied her lungs sent sparks throughout her body. She wanted to feel more of him, more of this pleasure, but her thoughts were cut short when he pulled back. He did not look her way, he simply rolled off her, zipped himself up, and got to his feet. Hinata watched as he bent down to pick up the jacket and shirt and left the room in silence. She sat up, confused. Then she heard faint scraping sounds, and suddenly, the door opened and then closed a moment later. And just like that, he was gone. She felt tears welling up, and as a single breath moved her, they graced her cheeks. Her fingers clenched on the sheets. He was cold. When this new grief wore off, Hinata slept peacefully. It was a strange peace. Her body was not used to this, whatever this was. Upon waking, she experienced an unwanted soreness between her legs. It was expected. She sat on her bed silently, but her mind was elsewhere. Misgivings and fears rolled in like waves, chilling her flesh and bones. She did not know what to think. A part of her longed for him and a part felt ashamed and feared her clan. Had she become too weak? She touched her red lips and they ached with the dull throbs of need. If they found out, they would banish her, disinherit her, or worse, kill her in the name of honor. There were stories in her clan of people being killed to hide away shame in the past. She had committed a terrible mistake when she invited Suzuki to her bed. She had dishonored the institution of marriage, a marriage not just between Naruto and her, but between two clans. She would be accused of whoredom, adultery, infidelity, and there would be no absolution for her. Not long had passed since Hinata felt pleasure, but now, she felt the arduous challenge of overcoming the thoughts that were beginning to frighten her. It was difficult to escape this tormenting indecisiveness. She looked down and noticed that his semen had dried up on her belly. It was time to clean her body of him. She stood up and gazed at her naked body and face in the mirror. A face with a confused expression stared back at her from the mirror. His cold attitude hurt her, but the mirror told no lies. She wanted this, so it was all right. Then a ghostly smile crept across her tender lips. Suzuki was distant, but he had delighted her immensely. He made her happy, and even if it was something fleeting, she enjoyed the experience that brought her nothing but contentment. She would see him again and invite him over to feel the same delights. If Naruto could have Sakura, why could she not have Suzuki? Why were they all never fair to her? This was fair. It was a stubborn thought, but she believed it to be right and just. He did not refuse her, he was a man, after all. She looked away, embarrassed by her reflection, smiling girlishly back at her without any guilt. And then, like a child, she lifted her eyes a bit to gaze at the woman grinning like a little girl who had received her first awkward kiss on the mouth. Hinata moved her hand up to touch the lips. Suzuki had kissed them, and they were still rosy and swollen despite the night that had cooled off her passions. She stood straight, warmth rushing to her pasty face, imbuing her cheeks with a bright glow. Boldly, as if to feel herself to be real, she covered her breasts with her own hands. She squeezed them slightly, closing her eyes, tilting her head back to let out an impassioned sigh. Remembering the night as though she had taken a sip of an intoxicating and redolent sake. Naruto had never pleasured her this way. She repulsed him. Every inch of her was a blight of a disease-filled reminder that he loved another. She was a scar, a terrible wound on his life that reeked of duty, a loveless marriage. How she hated this marriage now, his betrayal, when only a few years back he could abate the mounting sadness in her with just a warm smile. He was the morning sun, warmth in summer, balmy breeze from the blues of seas. Hinata opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling fan, and a little tear traced an irregular path down her cheek. She felt nothing for him now, and it made her happy. She moved her hand down, tracing the round curve of her breasts, retracing the paths Suzuki had touched with his hands. Her lashes trembled. It was an enormous feeling of lust that came over her. She desired him so much that, every time her hand moved a little lower, tiny, muted sobs shook her like a babe being denied its repose. Finally, she touched her genitals, and her tactless fingers tangled in the rough hair. It was beginning to ache again, and she felt empty. Moving her finger across the lips, she collected slippery mucus from between the folds on her forefinger. She bit down on the lower lip, swaying like a somnambulist that stood alone in a room, surrounded by the fumes from dreams. She closed her eyes and enjoyed the feeling of her warm finger against the fleshy core, but it was not enough. Hinata let out a loud sigh and unburdened herself of the onus of her father, clan, marriage. She withdrew her fingers and stared at herself and tucked a few strands of hair behind the ear. She did not care for them anymore. She would find a way to break free. She would let them conquer her spirit no longer. Suzuki had left a hasty note on the rack. It instructed her to be on the training grounds before the sun came up. She obliged, albeit she was angry with him. Now, she stood under the clear sky on the training grounds, wearing that old genin outfit she had tucked away in one of the trunks she brought with herself from home. She never expected to use it again, but fates were smiling on her today. Everyone was here, even Naruto, standing with their heads bowed. Naruto looked tired and weary, his eyes surrounded by deep black circles. On his right was Sakura. She was patting on his back. An expression of sympathy remained pasted on her face. Niji stood opposite her, his eyes white. He was a kind man, the only man from her clan who opposed her marriage. He visited her home once a week, but due to the recent burden of missions, she had not seen him for 2 months. He had apologized to her profusely at the Hidden Mist village that he would find more time for her. She loved him for his honesty and perseverance to hold his own on Suzuki's team. He smiled when she looked at him. They stood at a little distance from the rest of the team. Niji was the assistant jonin, after all. She moved her head a little to look at the 2 lines of 20 chonins that stood in an orderly manner, a few feet from each other. She was curious to see who else was on the team, but she recognized no one. Other than Suzuki and Niji, all of them were chonins. Naruto and Sakura were contenders for the 3rd and 4th jonins on the team, but Suzuki had not offered a letter of recommendation to the Umbu commander, so they remained, stuck, at the same posts. Presently, Suzuki was pacing in between the 2 rows, lecturing the shinobis on the merits of being on top of the jonin teams in Konoha and how it would shame him if they slumped down to the 2nd spot. Hinata stood erect when she heard him shout at a man she did not recognize. "Do I look like a fool to you?" Suzuki asked and pointed his hand at himself. The man in front was sweating by the buckets. "Seisu I mean, no, Suzuki-sama," he sputtered out in a loud voice, puffing out his breast. He looked constipated as if he was about to squeeze out a very large egg. "Shut up, you fool." Suzuki spat in his face and took 1 step back. "Pay attention when I'm talking to you, you hear me?" Sasuke stretched his hand and poked at the man's temple with his fingers and pushed him back. The man staggered back, still nodding like his head was a part of an automatic mechanism. He stepped forward with lightning speed, took the exact same spot, and stood erect, his eyes bulging out. Sasuke cast one last hateful glance his way and resumed his back and forth walk. The examinations are approaching, and if any one of you fails, he paused and held up one finger, and his face changed with an angry smile, I'll ruin your lives. Understand? Loud, yes, Sasuke-sama, sounds rose up from all the Chunins. Even Hinata muttered a squeaky yes and dropped her gaze when she saw Sasuke flick her an expressionless glance. When no one said anything more, Sasuke created a surprised look on his face and said, "What the fuck are you people looking at me for? Get lost and carry out the team exercise we discussed yesterday." They all scrambled at his command. Even Hinata began with a start, not sure what she was supposed to do. "Not you, Hinata. You're coming with me," Sasuke said, stopping her in her tracks. "Niji, oversee the exercise, and if someone doesn't perform, send him home. This isn't a support team for freeloaders." Niji nodded and marched off in the team's direction. Hinata's eyes kept following him, and then she tore away her gaze and brought it on Sasuke. He leaned against a tall and large tree a few feet away and looked at her. His eyes and face were without the heat and passion she saw last night. His aloofness surprised her. "Focus your chakra into your hands and make a kunao-like shape," he commanded and folded his arms. Hinata gulped and felt the weight of his eyes on her. It was strange that they were intimate with each other not that long ago. He was distant, far too distant than she would have liked him to be. Focusing on the task at hand, she clenched her fingers and cracked her knuckles a few times before she held out her palms and focused chakra into them. It looked nothing like a kunao but more along the lines of an irregular jagged rock. She was very embarrassed. When she stopped the flow and lowered her eyes, Sasuke made a small hum sound. He did not seem impressed. "You've been out of practice for 5 years. I didn't expect you to accomplish anything," he said and looked up at the birds sitting in a big tree opposite. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't work hard to improve yourself. There are few simple ways to improve chakra control." He pushed himself off the tree's rough trunk and walked to her. Hinata stepped back a little and felt her face get warm again when Sasuke stopped only inches from her. "There's the long and hard way, and then there's a shortcut. If I choose the hard way, you'll be stuck in the genin rut for sage knows how long. I doubt you'd want that. So I'll teach it to you through a different method. Hold out your hand," he said and held out his. Looking at him, Hinata slowly moved her hand up. He took it in his grasp and ran a bit of his chakra through it. His chakra was extremely powerful, and it made her heady. "This is a very small amount of my chakra. You won't be able to handle anything more," he said, holding her hand. "My chakra has a certain pattern every chakra does, but it's tamed and regular. It won't be able to perfectly regulate yours, but it'd give it the right push to regulate itself. I used this method to teach you to perfect his medical jutsus. How will I?" Hinata asked and looked at his eyes. "You'll have to keep trying to form a perfect kunao." He loosened his grip. And he broke off when he saw how quickly she pulled her hand back and gazed about to make sure no one was looking at them. There was a sense of urgency in her actions, and he did not like it. He frowned. "What are you doing?" Hinata jerked her head up and put her hand to her breast. She looked hot and confused. She had yet to detach herself from that lovely experience, and this small distance between them was making her feel awkward and embarrassed. "And nothing," she muttered and held her left hand tightly in the other. "Listen," he said and inched a little closer and leaned down his head to meet her eyes, "whatever happened between us doesn't make it outside your bedroom. Do you understand me? Grow up. Unless you want to remain locked up in your house forever, I suggest you stop this and toughen up. Otherwise, you're just another meal for Namikaze." Hinata moved her head a little and gazed up at his stern face and that cold expression. Sasuke backed away and wiped his sweaty face on his sleeve. It was getting warm. "Go over to you and cut through 20 chakra blocks in an hour, and then come back to me again. Don't just cut through them. Turn off your chakra every time and mix it with mine to smooth it out. Go," he ordered in a flat tone and shoved his right hand into his pocket. Hinata turned around and jogged off in Yu's direction. He stood with Sakura and two other medics under the shade of a sprawling tree. As she walked past Sakura, she met her sea-green eyes for a fleeting moment. She noticed a strange look in them that she could not understand. Hinata stood at the far end with Yu and closed her eyes to mix Suzuki's chakra with hers. It ran through her like a spark, delighting her senses all over again. Suzuki may have been prickly by nature, but she was not used to these sensations to forget them so easily. Opening her eyes, she gathered chakra into her hands again, and when it materialized, it was a little less irregular. She thrust it forward when you created a thick chakra block. It did not even dent it. She cut off the supply and tried again. This time, a nick in the block made her feel happy. She looked over her shoulder and saw Naruto create a large spinning raise-non and add futon to it. He threw it forward, cutting all 3 stones in front. A ninja who stood with him slapped his hands onto the ground and 3 stones jutted out again. She looked ahead, and even if a part of her felt remorse, it was too little, too late. She stopped the chakra flow and gathered it again when Sakura interrupted her. When did you decide to join the squad, Hinata? Hinata turned around, and her focused chakra disappeared in frilly fogs about her hands. Why yesterday, she answered, with timidity, blocking out feelings of her distaste for this woman, a woman who had aided Naruto in making her life miserable. Ah, that's nice. She said in an odd voice as though she was forcing herself to speak and wheeled around to fully face her. I heard Suzuki personally invited you to join the team. Is that right? He never extended us this courtesy. Isn't he whimsical? Sakura, if you don't complete this, Suzuki-sama will get angry again. Do your work and let her practice. She has a lot to do before she reports back to him, you said firmly, created another block, and urged Hinata to resume her training. I know. You don't have to remind me, Sakura returned with a calm smile and went back to the other 2 medics. An odd sort of expression was moving over her features like a phantom's hand. She kept moving her eyes back and forth between the medic in front of her and Suzuki. Hinata felt the first tremors of something like unease. This woman was strange. Hinata started gathering chakra into her hands and kept looking out of the corner of her eyes at that face softening and contorting, and then back again, under the influence of an intense emotion. Something about Sakura made her spine tingle with an uneasy sensation. There was just something about her, and Hinata could not say what. Chapter 10, Here Comes Trouble. A whole day had passed by in training. Hinata thought it would be easy, but it was not. She remembered when she and Miyuki first cut a swathe along the pathway that led to her home. Her fingers and bones had hurt like hell. A deep ache had set in, but this was impossible. She sat in a large wooden chair in Suzuki's office and looked down to her deeply bruised palms. They were swollen, with sickly green veins popping out of the skin. When she tried to curl her fingers, a sharp pain went through her whole arm. Suzuki had given her a very hard time. She did not understand him. It was as if he had a different face for everything, a new facade for all occasions, and she could hope to pull one away completely before a new one formed in its place. Sighing, she slumped over the table and gazed down at her dirty nails. Then her gaze wandered off left and right and outside the window, which was left slightly open, across from the large table. A cool breeze touched her face with lightness and moved the golden, blazing red, tangerine leaves on trees and the ones scattered through the ground outside. Sun had traveled below the horizon, and variations of deeper hues were beginning to go tumbling across the last merry bits of day. Suzuki told her to wait in the office, and, obediently, she had been sitting here, waiting for the last 15 minutes. The rest of the team completed tough exercises one after another. She was glad this was her first day. Today, she felt a pang of worry for Naruto's daily routine. Suzuki had denied him the Jonin post because he was falling behind, his family had forced her upon him, and Sakura probably added to his troubles. Hinata did not know what to feel for him. Maybe these thoughts were the last bits of her love for him that made her experience something unwanted. She was slowly letting go of it, steeling herself for what was to come. The quietness of her thoughts was constantly disturbed by the noises outside, but there would always be the comfort and loneliness of her home, a sanctuary and prison. Hinata sat up straight when she heard soft sounds of steps on the wooden floor outside, and within seconds, Suzuki entered the office, leaving the familiar vague smell of something fragrant and musky in his wake. It lingered in the air, persistent, not ready to leave in spite of the steady draft pouring into the room that was being warmed by fire. Putting the scroll down on the table, he pulled down the zip on his jacket, taking it off and throwing it on the back of his chair. Sweat was visible at his throat, drying out in the heat the fireplace exuded. He pulled the heavy chair back and sat down. Not a second passed when he raised his hand and took off the headband and threw it onto the table. It clanked on the hard surface there. After that quick ritual, he leaned back into the chair and closed his eyes. He looked tired. Hinata kept looking at Suzuki's face, covered in a film of sweat. The dark hair around his face clung to the skin. He just sat there, eyes closed, arms resting on the armrests, not looking at her or anything. He was quiet as if sleeping in the big chair. Moments passed and he finally opened his eyes, bringing his gaze to her curious face. There were traces of bloom in her cheeks now. He held his gaze for a moment and watched as her face began to redden even more. "How was your first day?" he asked and moved his head back to look up at cobwebs hanging from the side of the still ceiling fan. A look of displeasure came to his face, but he quickly schooled his features. It was good," she said in a very small voice and fiddled with the button on her jacket with nervousness. Suzuki let out a soft laugh and sat upright. "Liar. There isn't a single shinobi on my team whose first day was ever good with me," he said with a playful expression and grabbed the scroll from the table. "So how was it?" She paused and mustered up a bit of courage to speak again. "It was a very difficult day. My hands are bruised, and I can't feel my fingers." She quickly looked away when she saw Suzuki smiling at her confession, his eyes on the scroll. "Get used to it. You've been out of practice 5 years. For a shinobi? It's a very long time. I'll tell you to heal you before you leave." He looked up for a fleeting moment and then dropped his eyes back to the scroll again. "Your performance wasn't good for a new genin. Step up your game if you want to stay in the squad. Right now, you're just in the trial slot." "Trial slot?" Hinata asked and wiped her sweaty hands on her pants. "Yes, a trial slot," Suzuki replied and rolled up the scroll and met her eyes. "I plan on throwing one freeloader out of the team. He's been getting on my nerves for a while now. The bastard didn't even perform today. I can train. I don't need another meddlesome medic on my team. He's useless. Better you than him." Hinata did not say anything and bent her head to look at her hands again. Suzuki tapped the table a few times with his knuckle. "Pay attention, Hinata. You'll keep on repeating the same exercise every day till you learn something. Clear?" he asked and slapped on the table lightly. Hinata nodded and rubbed her palms on her dirty and sweaty pants again. Her hands were starting to itch now. "I'll have to come daily?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Suzuki looked at her with an incredulous expression as if that was not obvious enough. "Of course." He paused, stood up, and made his way around the table towards her chair. "You won't get any special treatment. Just 'cause of the nice time we had together." He looked down at her, wearing a wisp of a smile on his handsome face. Hinata averted his gaze, which was heavy upon her, and looked outside the window again. There, on a supple tree branch, sat that tiny hawk Suzuki called Kirin. It was sitting there with an obedience that was unnatural for a bird, cocking its head and craning its neck to look left and right, whilst Suzuki was walking about in the office to get another scroll. Hinata thought it looked adorable. She had this urge to grab it in her fist and stroke its flecked feathers. "Your bird," she said and pointed at the window. Suzuki walked to the window and opened it a little more and looked outside. When he made a small hand gesture, Kirin let out a melodious sound and flew to him. It landed on his shoulder and bounced excitedly when he reached into his pocket to feed him. "I told Nii-sama not to send you here so early," he said in a gentle voice and stroked his feathers lightly, "but I guess he knows that I get lonely without you." He smiled and leaned against the table. Hinata smiled, too, admiring the all-white softness of Suzuki's features in the golds of dusk's light. He looked happy today, his countenance serene, undisturbed by any burden. A part of her envied him. He did not know trouble the way she did. Feeling it every day, a contagion that ate away at her insides and made her face crumble to reveal a telling countenance that hid nothing. She was a terrible liar. Sasuke knew how to hide his heart. Perhaps, staying close to him, she would end up learning the art of secrecy, something she could never learn in her home. Her eyes were still transfixed on his face that she did not realize when he had started looking back at her. "Something wrong?" he asked, breaking her from quiet thoughts. "And no," she said quickly and turned her gaze to look at the hawk again that had hidden itself well behind Sasuke's jaw-length hair. It surprised her that it was playing with Sasuke. "What are my chances to clear the trial period?" "That's up to you. If you work hard, nothing is impossible. I'll instruct Niji to help you out because I've got my hands full with missions for a week. I won't be around to train you," he explained. Hinata's heart felt the longing, and her untrained, honest lips moved before she could stop them, and she whispered, "When will I see you again?" A subtle but playful expression scurried across his face before it disappeared behind his well-guarded countenance. "I can come see you tonight if you want," he said in a smooth, deep voice and leaned down to meet her passion-touched eyes. "Naruto will stay at the academy again, but you already knew. Aren't you naughty, Hinata?" He backed away and left behind that peculiar scent of his in the air, a scent she loved. Hinata bent her head down and peered through the curtain of hair over her eyes at her shivering hands. Nervousness bothered her mind and body again. What was she doing? This was not right. Out of the corner of her eyes, she gazed at his face. The allure in his eyes was gone, vanished behind the mask he always wore. His eyes took on that ferocious red color and turned to look at the door. 3 perfect tomos moved in a circle before coming to a halt. "Go home," he said, and his eyes fixed on the door. "I'll come by after I'm done here." "Yes," Hinata said and stood up, moving her aching fingers a bit. They still hurt, but, at least, the itchiness was gone. "You should be done with his work by now. Ask him to heal you," he said and folded his arms across his breast when he heard the knock on the door. "Come in, Sakura." The door opened and revealed the pink-haired woman who wore that same strange expression on her face, which had turned red and sweaty under the sun. It lost its intensity almost immediately as her eyes turned to Sasuke, her tight expression eased. Hinata did not understand her. Quietly, she made her way out of the office and closed the door behind her. "Office hours are over," Sasuke said and watched her as she made her way around the table and stopped close to him, too close. "Go home, unless you have something important to tell me." "I came to give you this," Sakura said and produced a scroll out of her jacket's pocket. A hearty smile was prominent on her lips. Sasuke took the scroll from her hand and unrolled it. A subtle hum sound escaped his lips before he rolled it back up and threw it onto the table. "I don't approve of these results," he said, and his features changed into a look of irritation. "What are you saying? Hokage-sama took the test, you have to accept these." She protested, looking helpless. "I don't," Sasuke replied, a hard look plastered on his face. "I'm the team's head jonin, and it's up to me to accept your results or reject them. That's what the rules say, anyway. And guess what? I don't trust your mentor." Sakura backed away a little, impatient. "What do you mean?" she asked and bit her lower lip in anxiety. "I don't know, maybe because you're her student that she feels the need to throw you into the best team in Konoha? You know, for her own reputation and your clan's. After all, Harano clan is unheard of," he said, his voice full of reproach. "That's not true," Sakura denied, raising her voice. "Don't shout, this is my office," Sasuke said with a heavy accent and clenched his teeth in a way as though he wanted to say more. "I've worked hard to get here and stay on this team, you know that. You know how good my chakra control is. It's the same as yours. I have good taijutsu and tailing skills. You just don't see it. You're unfair to me," Sakura accused, her voice shaking with emotion now. "You think I'm a fool like Naruto?" he asked and pushed himself off the table to tower over her, his expression losing the restraint with a whiplash of anger. "You damn well know how you got here. Your parents pleaded before the Hokage, and she told you the Jonin team test from the goodness of her heart." He took in a heavy breath, seething with pronounced irritation, touching his heart in mock indignation, but he was not done yet. "No," he went on, letting out the pent-up frustration he had built up for years, for he hated her mentor. "You little cheater. I had to give you extensions, work around the test timings, group you up with you, and send you off to that damned woman's office almost daily so that you could make up for your training. Don't mock me." Sakura fell silent. She knew he would never fall for her lies. It was no use, and she could not tell him the truth. It was better to lie for now. "It's true," she began another lie and looked down to her feet. "I didn't come here on hard work alone. It was Hokage-sama's love for me and my parents' prayers that I am where I am today, but that's also true that I've worked hard since then. I've done everything you've ever asked. I passed all the exams. Sasuke, I've done whatever you asked. Don't be that unfair to me." Her breath, caught in her throat, came out as a little sob. She moved her hand up and wiped the tears from her eyes, as if to push her worries down. Sasuke's expression softened just a bit. "What do you want?" "I'm tired," he said and kneaded his brow. "I don't care what your reasons are to stay here. I won't accept your test results. The team exams will take place a week from now, and you will oversee the medical division's tests with a few other ninjas from my clan. If you fail, I don't care what you do, I'll throw you out faster than you can grovel before your persuasive mentor. That's my final word. I'll have to give the tests again. And you is a chunin, he can't oversee anything," she said, her expression accusatory. "You will if you want to stay. And you gave Jonin exams 2 weeks ago. I sent his letter of recommendation to the Umbu division. The approval letter came in today," Sasuke said, and there was a clear note of triumph in his sly voice. "Is that all? If it is, you can leave. I have work to do." Sakura inched closer and leaned up to press her cheek against his jaw. To her surprise, he did not protest. You know I didn't stay just to preserve my clan's honor. I stayed here for you, too," she whispered in his ear, and then left the office in silence and with a heavy heart. Hinata sat in the room's shadows. One lantern sat on the table, its flame danced on the wick, threatening to go out any second as the wind outside turned rough. She had just made it home when Miyuki gave her the message from Minato. She did not even have time to rest. Next to her sat her husband, his head bowed and his face tense. He was silent, unable to answer his father's questions. "Naruto, your father has asked you something," Kushina spoke and adjusted the shawl draped around her small shoulders, with delicate hands. Her long red hair hung down her back like a smooth curtain. They were spread on the floor behind her, wispy and numerous on the shiny wooden floor. She was an uncannily young-looking woman, pretty, with a sprite-like appearance. Sluggishly, Naruto raised his head up, eyes tired and weary. He looked very ill. I don't have anything else to say. I already told you, it's just not working," he said, voice weary, and raised his hand to palm his face. "Perhaps you are not trying hard enough," Minato spoke heavily and turned his blue eyes a little to look at Hinata. He was still very youthful and handsome for someone just a year shy of 50 like his wife. "You will turn 25 soon. I married you off 5 years ago in hopes of preserving our clan through you. The Hyuga clan wanted the same, yet here you are, sitting before me with nothing but excuses." "Father," Naruto protested but clamped his lips tightly together when Minato raised his hand. "I do not want to hear any more excuses from you. How difficult is it to have a child with a healthy woman?" Minato spoke, his voice heavier than before, laced with authority despite what had become of his clan, but his wife was enough to anchor and shield his name from complete ruin. Her marriage to Minato was quite the scandal back in the day. She was from a prestigious Uzumaki family, and despite the mass slaughter of her clan some decades back, they were still many in number, living in Edi village under Konoha's protection. They were famous for their sealing jutsus and medicinal herbs, an irreplaceable asset for Konoha's ever-growing military power. "Did you go to Shizuan, Hinata?" Kushina asked, clearing her throat. "I made an appointment for you yesterday, but she told me that you never came. May I ask why?" Her greenish eyes were dark and inquisitive in the shadows. Hinata looked up at her and avoided Minato's crystal-like blue eyes. She could see a bit of Naruto in him. I joined Sasuke-sama's team. I forgot. It's not like I haven't gone there before many times. She doesn't have anything new to say to me, anyway," Hinata said and drew in a deep sigh. You joined that Uchiha's team? Why? Minato asked, looking stern now. However, before Hinata could say something in her defense, Naruto forestalled her loudly, and what's wrong with that? It's not like Sasuke would ruin her family's name or anything. He just wanted a new hand on the team. It'd benefit the Hyuga clan to be under the Uchiha. He looked away, huffing. I know Sasuke means a lot to you, Naruto, but your wife needs to be home if she is to raise a child, Kushina reasoned and looked calmly from the fuming Naruto to the quiet Hinata. Not to mention that Daemon incident. It cannot be forgotten. Sage knows what these Uchihas are planning, Minato accused in the softest voice, with a slow shake of his head. Have you invited me here to accuse and insult Sasuke? Naruto asked, his temper flaring. If it wasn't for Sasuke, I was done for. No one would take me into their teams. It was Sasuke who looked out for me. No thanks to you, father. Naruto, behave yourself. You are speaking to your father. Apologize, now. Kushina spoke in a disapproving tone and placed her hand tenderly on Minato's shoulder. And you, mother? You didn't stop being a ninja when you married father, and even after you had me. Are all your rules for me to make my life more miserable? Naruto said loudly, not backing down. No one is making your life miserable, Naruto, Minato spoke, his voice still calm, and closed his eyes, his countenance weary. He looked hurt by his son's honesty. I am not your enemy. I am your father. You know how the Uchihas are and how Hinata would suffer if she failed to bear us and her own family an heir. Niji would have been a fair match, but he is from the branch family. You know how it is. The head family's few sons are wedded off within the head family. Hayashi had little choice in the matter. His own family line was dying. Try to understand things. You are not a child. The thought of Niji came suddenly to Hinata's mind. That was true, she wanted this union with Niji long ago, it was the wish of a girl's heart. He was a kind and handsome man, sober, loving, brave. If her father had wedded her off to him, she would not have been plagued by a lonely and shameful life. Just today, when she saw him looking at her again, she felt a sudden jolt of that old wish rise in her with an intensity that only the thoughts of Sasuke stopped it. Alas, she was just lonely these days. There you go again. You just can't stop accusing the one person I care about the most, don't you? Naruto said and leaned forward, the whiskers on his face standing on ends. He looked livid. Your accusation got half of his clan killed. Don't deny it. As for an heir, then you'll get one when I feel like going near her. He hastily got to his feet and glanced down at Hinata for a fleeting moment and spun around to leave. Naruto, do not shy away from your responsibilities. Do not forget the hardships faced by your parents. Do not be selfish. This is not just about you. Think on it, Minato spoke, holding Kushina's hand in his. I'm going over to the academy. I've got to prepare for the Jonin and team tests in the coming weeks. I don't have time for this, he said without turning around, and left all of them silent in the living room. He has grown into such a spiteful child, Minato spoke aloud and heaved a painfully long sigh. Then he raised his eyes to look at Hinata, who was still staring down at her healed hands. If he does not come near you, then you as a wife can go near him. You are a woman and the daughter of a respectable clan. It is not just Naruto's responsibility to shoulder his own clan's honor. It is yours, as well. Minato is right. Think about your clan and the shame your father will face if people find out that Naruto does not care for you. Or sage forbid, they start thinking that you are a barren woman. You have no idea what that would do to your father, Kushina spoke with an air of her clan's superiority over hers. Hinata did not like her tone, but she stayed quiet. I will ask a servant to escort you back to your house, Minato spoke and rose to his feet, so did Kushina. In the light, Hinata's eyes fell upon the white haori he wore that still bore the red pattern of his clan since his Hokage days. It's a right, I'll manage, Hinata replied and stood up, too. Thank you for the dinner. She bowed and turned around to leave the big house. It took her a good 30 minutes to make it back to the forest's familiar boundary that marked the moor's beginning. The night was quiet, its silence broken up a little by the wind. Somewhere out there in the darkness, an owl hooted, and crickets made a little noise, but because of the light rains, the forest fell asleep too soon before the moon even had a chance to shine down upon it with all its intensity. Minato's and Kushina's words hurt her deeply. Naruto did not want her, even they could see that much. How could she ever pursue him to bed her? He never made love to her, it was always a responsibility, a ritual for him, which he tried to complete without leaving his seed inside her. He wanted his parents to break off this marriage. This was not the first time they were called before them, they asked the same questions, and she gave the same answers that always left her utterly humiliated. Slowly, Hinata walked along the snaking stream that led to her house. Her eyes were downcast, looking at the vegetables poking out from the scraped soil. She had planted new seeds few weeks ago, and new buds were reaching out above the ground now. The recent rains had been beneficial. Tending to the Murs would be Miyuki's duty now, as she would be working hard to gain that spot on the team. When she would get it, she would try and break free, she just needed a little reassurance. With that thought, she raised her eyes to look at the door. She stopped in her tracks, and her cheeks flushed light pink. Sasuke was standing on her doorstep, gazing at her, a breeze-light smile about his lips. He had not forgotten that she invited him over to her place. After that grueling humiliation at Minato's home, the thought of making love to him filled her with profound happiness. Check the description for the links to the author.